Pichamon is a China specialist. She has expertise on Chinese foreign policy and the political economy of sustainable development in the Asia Pacific. She was also a star attraction at last year's Australian Institute of International Affairs National Conference in October. She's a senior lecturer in international relations and development at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales Australian Defence Force Academy in Canberra. So without further ado, I will cross now live to another part of Canberra. Take it away, Pichamon.
Well, thank you very much, Bryce, for that kind introduction. And I am indeed in Canberra, although I've chosen to use Shanghai as my virtual screen. It's a pleasure to join you this evening, and really thank you to the AIIA and to Bryce for having me this evening, but also to all of you at home who are joining us this evening. I hope all of you are well and healthy, and I hope that you will enjoy is not really the right word, is it? But that you will find the following presentation interesting. I will now share my screen so that we can go to my slides that I've prepared, which hopefully all of you will now see. So the talk I will be presenting this evening is about COVID-19, implications for Chinese investment and economic influence. I think in many respects, we're all probably very much inundated by news about COVID-19 and its impacts. And most of it, of course, is rather depressing news to be receiving relentlessly sometimes, as it feels. In this presentation, what I will try to attempt to do is to present not only the negative implications that are stemming from COVID-19, but also to look at possibilities for positive change, for improvement post COVID-19. I cannot promise that I will be able to deliver that note of hope, but I will certainly endeavor to try my very best. So to begin, we really need to, of course, start thinking about or look at what the socio-political and economic impacts of COVID-19 are for China. And I'm sure all of you have been following very closely how the pandemic has evolved within China, especially within the city of Wuhan. Suffice it to say, of course, I won't go through all of it in detail, but it is an undeniably disruptive force. It's the case, of course, that in economic terms, current GDP growth forecasts for China are now estimated to be either between 1 to 2% or 1.7 to 3.5% on a more positive or optimistic note. What this also presents is the problem of high levels of debt that the Chinese economy has accumulated over the past decade. And as such, the recovery of the Chinese economy will very much depend on not only consumer spending returning to normal levels, but also on the full recovery of its manufacturing industry. So these are rather large obstacles that the Chinese government and Chinese society more broadly will need to overcome, especially considering how industrial production within the country has declined by at least 13.5% within the first 2 months of this year. And of course, this generates broader implications for domestic stability within China. And as we all know, the Chinese government in particular has a long-held obsession with domestic stability and with economic growth because it sees the two as being intricately interlinked. And so for that reason, it is the case that COVID-19 is expected to have much longer-term impacts on the Chinese domestic landscape in terms of people's perception of the CCP, its effectiveness in responding to the pandemic, but also its legitimacy. We've all heard, of course, about the draconian measures that were implemented, especially in the city of Wuhan, and how the government was extremely adept in tracking down people who had left the city. And this raises concerns, of course, not only with regard to privacy issues, but it also raises concerns for people within China about how much interference the government has within their daily lives. Of course, these are not new questions or not new problems. However, the pandemic has certainly spotlighted these issues, and it does mean that the CCP moving forward, the Chinese Communist Party, will certainly have to focus a lot on rejuvenating economic growth within the country and also regaining any lost legitimacy during this pandemic. At the same time, these questions about domestic stability also impinge very clearly on, again, political legitimacy, as well as the longevity of the CCP itself. The photos that I have up there are taken from a post from the People's Daily, and as you can see, it presents Xi Jinping addressing a group of Chinese doctors via teleconferencing, and also comparisons being made between previous administrations about how, you know, Chinese leaders needed to go into the field and meet with the people and still care about the people. But of course, the clear contrast there is Xi Jinping doing all of this from afar, as opposed to actually going into the ground, onto the ground and meeting with people. And certainly there have been other episodes involving officials meeting with locals in Wuhan and elsewhere, and locals saying that it's merely being staged and it's not really genuine sympathy that's being demonstrated. Having said that, what we're also seeing as perhaps a means for the CCP to regain political legitimacy is also a rise in patriotism, especially from younger Chinese nationals. And we see this especially coming through very strongly in response to the anti-Chinese racist outbursts, especially vis-a-vis the United States. And so we're actually witnessing very interesting tensions there. That may well also impact how Chinese society overall develops in the coming months, if not years. But really I won't go into further detail on that, but I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. But what does this all mean for COVID-19's impacts on global and regional supply chains, and what does it mean for what we've been talking a lot for a long time now, which is a China dependency in these global and regional supply and value chains. Well, given how the United Nations has already estimated that global growth is going to be -3% as a result of COVID-19, it's in no way surprising that global and regional supply chains have also been severely disrupted. Having said that, it's very hard to estimate the degree, the full extent of this disruption, in large part due to the fact that there is a fair amount of sector and country variation. So the garment industry, for example, is going to be impacted by COVID-19 in a different way from, let's say, the footwear industry or something else. So as a result, this is something that we have to take into consideration when estimating or trying to assess the full impact of COVID-19 on these supply chains. But in terms of the question on dependency, it's become even more clear than before that most supply chains regionally, globally, are indeed very much dependent on China. And this was a discussion that we had, of course, even before COVID, and certainly with the US-China trade wars in last year. This also highlighted to countries, especially in Southeast Asia, that dependency on China is not a good way forward, and that there needs to be greater diversification, means to become less reliant on China providing, or Chinese companies providing, the raw materials for many of these manufacturing and industry-based supply chains. Having said that, it's not always clear, of course, how quickly this change can happen in terms of moving away from China, and certainly it's not going to be a transformation that can happen overnight. But of course, there are observations that have been made that if we look at the gradual diversification that's been taking place ever since last year with the US-China trade war, ASEAN actually is in a slightly better situation to deal with the impacts of COVID-19 than if that diversification hadn't taken place at all. But to give you an even hopefully clearer example of that the level of dependency that we see. I've been conducting field work in Cambodia, in Myanmar and Laos, Vietnam, speaking with garment factories within the region, many of which are, of course, Chinese owned. This is particularly the case in Myanmar and Cambodia. And of course, the garment industry in both countries amount for a lot in terms of the countries, both countries' GDP. So for example, in Myanmar, the garment sector accounts for, provides jobs for around 700,000 workers. It generates $4.66 billion in export revenues, which is equivalent to about 10% of Myanmar's exports. However, China supplies 90% of the raw materials needed by the industry. And so, as you might imagine, as a result of COVID-19, a lot of these factories have had to close down temporarily because they can't get raw materials from China. And that, of course, has a knockdown, a flow-on effect impacting employment, local employment, but also on levels of demand. So at the moment, even though supplies are gradually coming back up to normal levels, it is the case that demand for products from the garment industry, those demands have effectively collapsed. For Myanmar, of course, this is just a snapshot, right? So this isn't even the full picture. If we consider the full picture, it would appear even more dire. Aung San Suu Kyi, of course, has already announced a public fund. However, this public fund is really can only really address immediate hardships on a very temporary basis. So it is in no way a longer term solution. At the same time, the country has sought to rely more on foreign investment flows, but that also is not really manifesting given the current situation. So even for major projects like the $1 billion Yangon Elevated Expressway, the Chinese company consortium that included a Chinese state-owned company has had to pull out of the project because it can no longer be involved in the tender, and presumably because the consortium involved is Wuhan based. From what I understand, it means that they can't actually access the financial resources needed to fund such a project as well during this time. Having said that, the situation in Myanmar is dire, but if we think I suppose in broader and in longer term perspective, one can expect, I think, that infrastructure investment, at least within the country, is likely to continue. And certainly the Chinese government itself, Beijing, has come out and said that it will continue to pursue and finance infrastructure investment, especially in consideration of the fact that the Belt and Road Initiative is such a major component of Chinese foreign policy now. And most recently, the Chinese government has committed to the fact that it will continue to progress at least 22 projects in Myanmar under the Lan Sa Mekong Cooperation Scheme, and another 33 projects under the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor in the Belt and Road Initiative. What this actually means in practice, we will have to wait and see. But the fact that the Chinese government, along with other governments like Japan and South Korea, the fact that they've committed to this is perhaps at least a source of hope, although some, of course, have also raised the specter of debt trap diplomacy yet again, suggesting that Chinese investment, large-scale investment or loans in this area may also result in greater debt dependency amongst low-income and middle-income countries. But again, these are things that we will have to wait and see, unfortunately, before we can make a very clear prediction. The photo that I have up here is of a Chinese Chinese factory, in Cambodia. And as you can see, this is a factory, there's Chinese words about safety safeguards and health measures and so forth. And also a little Chinese sign wishing prosperity and so forth for the Chinese New Year. The reason why I have this up is because it's a similar situation in Cambodia, where a lot of the garment factories in the country are also Chinese owned. And it is also the fact that the garment industry is one of the largest sectors in Cambodia, and a major revenue revenue source for the Cambodian government. And as a result, the forced closures of Chinese-owned factories across the country has also had very severe economic impacts on Cambodia. And there will certainly be longer-term impacts in terms of domestic stability, but also the welfare of workers themselves. So what this brings us to really are the even broader questions, bigger questions about the sustainability of Chinese overseas investment, as well as the Belt and Road Initiative post-COVID-19. Questions about sustainability have been raised. Again, it's not new to COVID-19, this COVID-19 situation, but they are questions that have been raised before. Questions that pertain not only to issues about the debt trap or the debt sustainability that Chinese loans and projects create for countries in Southeast Asia and beyond, but also in one sense, and an aspect that we don't really talk about as much in the media, at least, is what, you know, the amount of Chinese loans and investment that's going overseas, what this amount of expenditure is having on the Chinese economy itself. As I mentioned earlier, the Chinese economy also faces high levels of debt. And currently, as a result of COVID-19, Chinese banks are now having to try and figure out what to do with a lot of non-performing loans, which means that this will only further limit their ability to extend loans or provide new loans to struggling Chinese companies. At the same time, when we think about the Belt and Road Initiative, we all know of how many of these large-scale Chinese projects are highly dependent on Chinese workers, on Chinese equipment, Chinese machinery, Chinese companies, as well as financing, of course, which means that, again, as a result of China's own domestic economic disruptions, the question really is, will China actually have the financial capabilities to continue to invest in and finance the Belt and Road Initiative and the many projects that it's promised? As I mentioned earlier, in Myanmar at least, the Chinese government has indicated that it will continue to honor its pledge to finance at least altogether about 55 projects across the country, including huge projects like the Jokpyu deep sea port and the special economic zone. But within China, at least, there's a growing sense of concern, to put it quite lightly, that the Chinese government, China itself, might not actually be able to finance these projects, at least not in a sustainable way, and to balance its domestic and its global obligations in that regard. It's also the case that with COVID-19, what we are most likely to see as part of the aftermath is will be many middle low-income countries asking China for debt relief or extensions to concessional loans. And again, this has already been happening to a smaller degree, just as the discourse and debate surrounding Chinese debt trap diplomacy arose. But I think we can imagine that, especially in Africa, where countries in sub-Saharan Africa are expected to be the worst affected by COVID-19 and its flow-on effects, we will probably see more countries coming to China asking for financial assistance. And it's not immediately clear, again, whether or not the Chinese economy can sustain this, or whether the Chinese government will have the material resources, economic resources, that will allow it to do so. And of course, if you, having spoken to some Chinese policymakers, diplomats early on, they had already indicated to me last year that debt, when it comes to debt relief, it's not a simple yes or no. There are many different political, economic considerations that they have to take into account, and as a result, providing debt relief on a large scale is just not feasible. And so, especially now with COVID-19, I think the answer is probably going to be that debt relief really isn't feasible at all, potentially. So moving on, I think I have about 10 minutes left. I guess the other question that all of this raises, aside from the sustainability of Chinese investment and loans and assistance, is what are the reputational impacts of COVID-19 on Chinese influence, especially within the economic realm, as well as the longer term viability of the Belt and Road Initiative. Oops, bad. In terms of these questions, it's quite interesting to see the very varied responses across countries globally to COVID-19, but also to attempts at so-called mass diplomacy on Beijing's part. And again, we can't underestimate actually the importance of reputational impact. These are concerns that are relevant not only to Chinese companies and investors, but clearly to the Chinese government as well. And this is because, a country's ability to develop affinity with another country can very much impact its ability to penetrate the host country's market, but also to win competitive tenders and so forth. So in terms, just to give you I think many of you might have come across some of these examples already, and certainly within Australia right now, the public debate kind of has this very polarized view about what China is doing in its responses to COVID-19 and its global spread. But to give you an example that's taken from Thailand, I was in Bangkok around February. I think it was about February. So that was when the COVID-19 had really taken a terrible grip over China, and fears were starting to mount in Thailand and in other Southeast Asian countries that it would soon spread widely within the region. But just as there was a lot of fear in Thai society, as well as some racist outbursts against Chinese tourists or Chinese people of Chinese descent within the country, there was also a kind of an outpouring of sympathy. So this was a poster, I guess, an electronic poster that I took in a shopping mall in Thailand. And as you can see, it's all about sending best wishes to Wuhan, Thai hearts to Wuhan, and so forth. So very positive messages of solidarity. There was also a lot of focus on, how China would extend a helping hand in times of disasters to Thailand. And so it was now Thailand's turn to reciprocate. However, things have transformed, I would say, or have evolved quite dramatically within a couple of months. So if that was back in February, fast forward to April, I'm not sure if some of you will have seen this, but there was a hashtag that was trending in Twitter at one point, #NAVI, which was all about, and I won't go into the details, but basically two groups of fan bases, Thai and Chinese, arguing with each other about this Thai actor, and it escalated very quickly, and it became a kind of a mudslinging match where national identities of either country were brought into the debate as well, into the mudslinging contest. And so this is one example that I took from Twitter, where, as you can see, a Chinese, presumably a Chinese commenter had basically said that they wish that Thailand would always be controlled by the military government. And the Thai responses ranged from comical to quite outraged. But to give you an example of this exchange between a Thai Twitterer and a Chinese one, the Chinese Twitter commenter said that maybe the mask you're wearing is made in China, whereas the Thai responded that coronavirus is made in China too. And these are very simplistic and slightly, ridiculous examples to be giving you, really, but it does sum up that polarization that we're seeing, not just in Thailand, but across the region as well. I'm sure all of you have been aware of how Cambodia, for example, has been very welcoming of China and assistance, and how that has also, in many respects, influenced how Hun Sen has responded to COVID-19. But even then, there is a discrepancy between official government responses and local perceptions of China and COVID-19, which means that over the longer term, these are probably going to become fissures within China's bilateral relations with these countries, and fissures that will need to be solved if the region is to kind of develop together and find a way out together from the crisis that this pandemic has created. So overall, I think I have about 3 minutes left. But just to conclude very quickly, and then again, I think I've probably raised more questions than I've actually answered them. But I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you have, and also to go into greater detail on some of the examples that I've raised from within Southeast Asia. But I think the point to be made here is that given this very complex economic interdependency between China and the rest of the world, not just Southeast Asia or the Asian region more broadly, it is very much the case that, you know, if China collapses economically or as a result, or socially as a result of COVID-19, we are all going to suffer. That's the nature of interdependence, whether we like it or not. And it is very much the case that, you know, at the end of the day, COVID-19 is a human tragedy. It's a challenge to all of humanity. And so for that reason, it does make a very poignant, poignant case for cooperation as opposed to conflict at this stage, at least. It's also the case that, you know, at the end of the day, I think, as I mentioned earlier, if China is able to use infrastructure investment as a means to prop up the economy, if it's able to follow through on its infrastructure investment in Myanmar and other countries in the region, this could also serve as the necessary economic stimulus that helps the ASEAN region to recover as well. I'm aware that I'm making quite big statements or claims here, but I think it is the case that we have to bear in mind that at the end of the day, you know, COVID-19 is a collective problem. It requires a collective solution. And so for that reason, decoupling from China, moving away from a China-dependent supply chain may be good ideas, but they aren't ideas that can be implemented immediately, and they shouldn't be implemented immediately. And there really needs to be that stronger sense of economic cooperation within the region in order to ensure that we weather this coming, but really it's already arrived, storm that COVID-19 has brought with it. So on that note, I think I will stop for now. I see that there have been some, stop share.
Okay, thank you so much, Pichamon. That was a fantastic talk. We have a few questions already. If you do have a question, make sure you go down to the Q&A and type it in. And if you like one of the questions that's already up there and you'd like to see it answered, make sure you click on the thumbs up to push it to the front of the queue. So in Australia, we often hear about debt trap diplomacy and how China is trapping smaller countries in the region in ways that are going to make them over-reliant on China. I'd like to pose the question of whether it's also true the other way around. For example, Aston Kwok asks, are there some BRI projects that are geopolitically too big to fail for China?
Yeah. No, certainly. That's again, this is the point about economic interdependence. It goes both ways. So even though a lot of the narrative about debt trap diplomacy has focused on the dependency of host countries, recipient countries of Chinese assistance, loans, investment, it does actually go both ways. So for example, the example that I gave about the Jokpyu deep sea port and the special economic zone, these are projects in Myanmar that are seen as major BRI projects. So they don't not only carry a very strong economic material incentive for the Chinese government to see through, but they also carry clear reputational implications as well, because they're seen as prestige projects almost for the BRI. So there are indeed projects that can't fail. And this is only going to tighten or further constrain Beijing's ability to back out of these projects as a result of COVID-19, but also its ability to, as a result, finance future projects, because in essence, a lot of these Chinese companies that are engaged in BRI projects, they have to put up their own assets domestically as collateral in order to get loans from Chinese banks. And so as a result of the state of the economy right now, it's highly unlikely that they are going to be able to pay back these loans, to get new loans to finance even bigger or provide greater financing to existing or not yet or about to exist projects. And so for that reason, these are all constraints on Chinese firms and the Chinese government more broadly. And as a result, the concerns about COVID-19's impact on the BRI is not just only about the debt that it will create for recipient countries, but the debt that it will also create for China itself.
Great. Staying with the topic of dependence for reliance for the moment, Christian van der Merwe asks, as you said, reliance on China for economic prosperity isn't a viable way forward for other countries. So realistically, what is the time frame to achieving diversification, and what are the main factors preventing it?
Well, this was a question that I've been trying to poach with some of the companies and factories that I've been speaking with, and they've not been able to give me a straightforward answer. So I'm afraid I can't really provide you with a straightforward answer either. Realistically, I think in terms of the timeline, it just varies so much depending on the country that you're talking about. So if we look at Cambodia, for example, which is highly dependent on Chinese assistance and concessional loans and investment, then diversification is probably not going to happen, at least within the next decade, I would say. Whereas if you look at a country like Myanmar or Vietnam, which has just more recently joined the China reliant regional supply chain, then there are greater chances for them to diversify, especially given now that the United States is also actively seeking to diversify away from China. So really it depends on the country, but it certainly, I think COVID-19 will see a strong surge in countries wanting to kind of hedge their bets more. And again, I think we're probably going to see that over the next couple of years.
Okay, let's turn from the broader picture of Chinese investment and foreign policy overseas to domestic politics. How do you think the pandemic and the influence on policies towards the pandemic is going to influence Xi Jinping's presidency, and perhaps to bring it back to this topic, how will that affect investment and development overseas?
Well, I think the Chinese government right now is trying to reconcile two tensions in essence. It's trying to reconcile the tension between focusing on domestic politics and focusing on its global posturing, especially vis-a-vis the United States, and it's also trying to manage between focusing on, in essence, kind of what it does domestically. In terms of trying to build up domestic legitimacy by admitting to its initial blunder in responding to COVID-19, but then also trying to kind of magnify its accomplishments in responding to COVID-19. So there are a number of tensions at play there. And speaking to colleagues within China, that tension is also very much perceptible to them. So many, of course, are aware of the case of Dr. Li, who was the very first whistleblower in all of this, but who later passed away as a result of COVID-19. And many Chinese citizens, I can say, are very much outraged as a result of his passing, and the fact that they had tried to cover up the virus has spread early on. But then at the same time, as time passes, the Chinese government has been very active in its domestic propaganda campaign. And as a result, what we've been seeing is news media within China kind of constantly putting on stories about the dedication of Chinese medical workers, the dedication of the Chinese government in seeing this crisis through. And of course, also spotlighting the integral role that Xi Jinping is playing in all of this. And this is what has created, I think, this polarizing effect in China's society, where one group is quite critical of the government, whereas another group is saying that, well, at least, it's only in China that you can see that amount of that kind of strict lockdown, draconian lockdown be put into effective and implemented in a very effective way. So at the end of the day, I think what we will see is a hyper-vigilant Chinese government in the coming months, if not years, hyper-vigilant against things that may be damning against the CCP in particular. And I think for Chinese people, at least, their focus will be on basically putting back together their lives and sustaining their livelihoods. So if anything, I think this is probably a chance for the CCP to try and boost economic growth so that it can win back favor from the Chinese population. But I think as a result, I think that's probably how it's going to play out in the coming months at least. So we're probably not going to see major change, unfortunately, but we're probably going to see a lot of undercurrents as a result of this COVID-19 against the Chinese government.
Right. Now we have a question from our own Alistair Roth, who is our executive director of the Victoria branch. He asked a question about Japan. Japan has provided stimulus funds or funds for Japanese companies to divest away from China, to shift production out of China. Do you think that this is likely to gather pace under the current environment? Is this something that you've been looking at?
Well, again, I think, yes, it is going to gather pace. And I mean, a lot of this diversification, divestment has already been taking place before the advent of COVID-19, but it will most likely gather pace as a result of COVID-19, because again, it's by diversifying, it not only results in less reliance, or one hopes less reliance on China, but it will also create more economic opportunities for other countries, especially in Southeast Asia, right? So in countries like Thailand or Malaysia or Singapore or Cambodia, or Vietnam really, it can create more opportunities for them to become important suppliers of raw materials and other such things needed for the manufacturing and industrial sectors in the region. So yes, I think it will gather pace. Whether or not it's effective, I think, is another question. But given that these are considerations that have been in place for a long while now, we'll have to, I think there is a high likelihood that we will see successful divestment from China, although not complete yet. Yeah.
Okay, we have another question on debt trap diplomacy. And it's on the likelihood that China's inability to provide debt relief will result in political effects. So will it result in debtor countries being asked to make other kinds of concessions to meet their obligations? For example, the port in Sri Lanka, or other kinds of concessions that those countries may be required or may be heavily encouraged to make as a debtor nation to China.
Right. I mean, this is what a lot of people are expecting, that if countries can't pay back the debt, then China is probably going to ask for some sort of asset. I think the Sri Lankan port is a slightly different example, in large part because of the domestic politics that were happening in the lead up to the Chinese taking over the port. Having said that, for example, there's this project in Myanmar. It's a steel steel plant that was very much supported by the Burmese military and is being funded by the China Development Bank. I think some months ago it was estimated, like this was official statement from the Myanmar government saying that the rate at which they had to pay back the debt was $345,000 daily. These are daily loan repayments to the China Development Bank. So imagine one can imagine whether or not Myanmar will be able to repay such amounts now as a result of COVID-19. So, I mean, if we look at examples like Angola and others, it could very well be that the Chinese might ask for certain resources to be paid back. But at this stage, I think China itself has to be extremely careful as to what projects it takes on. The Sri Lankan port, for example, is not a moneymaker. And so if China were to take on more of those assets, even if they do serve a strategic value, it might only add extra burden on their own economy, which could then lead in adverse impacts over the longer term. So I think these are all cost-benefit calculations that have to be taken into consideration and which will possibly help to prevent any debt trap, that kind of debt trap dynamic from happening.
Great. We have a really interesting question from Patrick Orchard. China may well be one of the first countries to reopen after COVID-19, maybe as a product of the fact that it was the first where large-scale infections happened. Is this likely to result perhaps in increased dependence on China as Chinese economic activity becomes a stimulus for a hard-hit global economy?
I've been wondering that question. I've been wondering about this myself as well, which is that there is that lag time, and if China gets the head start, does that mean it's in a better position? But I think, when it comes to economic activity, you really do need more than just one actor. So even if China goes around trying to finance infrastructure projects and so forth, if the local government doesn't have the capacity to shoulder such a project, then that also adds a limitation, a very real limitation on China's ability to engage in such economic activity. So even if China does have a head start, I think if anything, that's probably a positive thing for the rest of the world at this stage, that there is at least one major economic power that's not completely straddled or completely constrained by COVID-19 and its effects. But having said that, it can possibly create greater relationships of asymmetry. And I think one of the concerns that people are seeing is that, China, despite COVID-19, despite mass diplomacy, hasn't given up on some of its traditional priorities. So it's still acting assertively, in the South China Sea, over the Taiwan Straits, and even in Hong Kong. So, I mean, if China's, I think that's the thing. Beijing needs to decide what kind of global posturing it wants to take, whether it's going to be assertive or whether it's going to be benign, because that will certainly have an impact on how receptive other countries are of Chinese economic activities within their countries, and in kind of bolstering or lessening those trading relationships with China.
That's great. Well, a great answer. So recently, there have been calls by the Australian government and others for a request for an independent international inquiry on the origin and handling of COVID-19. Perhaps taking it back to your expertise on Australian politics or Australians' relations with China, what do you make of these calls? Will they harm Australia politically? Are there other aspects of that issue that we're not really seeing? Can you shed some light on that for us?
So in relation to the Maurice Payne's international independent review of the WHO and China's handling of the pandemic, I assume that's the key point there. I actually gave another interview about this just the other day. I think my response was simply that, in principle, a review should be welcomed by all parties. It is important that people understand what is the virus's origins, that they cooperate in establishing that knowledge, but also to better understand the effectiveness of government responses, not just China's, but all countries' responses to COVID-19 as well, if only to create lessons learned for future generations, right? I think that the problem there is when these issues get overly politicized, and I think we're seeing some degree of that in Australia right now, for both understandable reasons, but also worrying reasons. I think it's still too early to politicize the issue because, again, we are still seeing human lives being lost. But it also means that, by kind of putting up these issues too early, we might actually risk cornering China and then driving it into embracing a renewed siege mentality, which would then mean that it becomes less cooperative with other countries within the region. So that's the worst case scenario that we don't want to see happen because, again, we already have interdependencies, relationships of interdependence. It is very much the case that, economic activity to some degree will be based on China's ability to come out and invest or finance, as we were discussing earlier. Even if countries want to diversify, it's not going to happen immediately. So given that we still have to live with China and there will still be some degree of dependency, Australia needs to be careful in that regard with how it's framing its relationship with China during these times, but also what the regional security implications will be if China feels like it's being cornered and if it feels like there's no point in being a constructive player anymore. Again, I think that the idea of a review is very much legitimate. It is needed, but I think it's how and whether it's being politicized is the bigger question that needs to be answered first.
Well, from a normative perspective, that's well and good. We should perhaps not to resort to protectionism. But we've got a question here from Annette McClintock who asks, will this precarious situation in regards to interdependence fuel calls for protectionism both here in Australia and abroad? So I'd sort of like to ask you if you could do a bit of crystal ball glazing. Crystal ball gazing. Could you let us know what you think is likely to happen? What sort of in relation to countries turning more protectionist, or are you pessimistic that the global situation is going to take a turn for the worst in terms of protectionism?
And I think this is where we should not be taking notes from the United States, especially under Trump. I think there will be, again, I think it will be a polarized debate. I think there will be certain sectors of society, not just in Australia, but also in other countries across the world that will be calling for protectionism, that will be calling for the production of medical supplies to be, to develop sovereign capabilities in that regard. And that's normal. But I think I think that the other sector, though, where who will kind of argue that protectionism not be pursued, and that trade relations continue that this kind of interdependence continues. I do think that faction will probably win, or maybe I'm just being too hopeful, but I think that's the reality. And even if countries were to try and pursue protectionist trade policies, I think that will ultimately backfire. Even if COVID-19 has taught us about the importance of self-preservation, I think it also teaches us the importance of having to cooperate with one another to cohabit this common global ecosystem. So as a result, I think, again, and already I think a number of economists are coming out and saying that we shouldn't be looking to completely divorce ourselves from China and a Chinese dependent supply chain. We should look to diversifying, but at the same time, we shouldn't be inward looking. We should actually be looking to try and forge more trade relationships to bolster what already exists as well. So I think political scientists in general aren't very good with crystal ball gazing, but that would be my own hope and what I imagine will happen in the region. And we're already seeing calls for this in ASEAN at the very least, for more countries to cooperate and not close their borders.
Yeah, I remember my political science professor at university telling me, here's my Australian political science, Australian politics 101. Never predict anything, you'll always be wrong. Right.
Yeah.
So we have another question here from Melissa. I guess it is related to closed borders, or whether China is going to regulate what comes out of its borders. If being a downstream customer of China becomes less viable in a post-COVID environment, is there a natural replacement or group of alternative providers of upstream goods and services you can suggest?
Ooh, that's a tough question.
Is China the only choice here?
Is China the only choice? I mean, currently, it can certainly look that way. And again, it depends on the country that you're looking at as well, where China has been the only choice for many, many years now. And so it sometimes is even just conceptually difficult for them to look beyond China and to see other partners. I think there was another question in the list that was asking about Vietnam as well. And I think this is where talking about other options might be possible, which is that, of course we have Japan, we have South Korea. Having said that, their wages are very high and they're at different points in the supply chain. But certainly for a country like Vietnam, for countries like Myanmar, there is still capacity for them to further develop their manufacturing and industry. And so as a result, I think we will probably see more foreign direct investment flow into these countries in order to help enhance their manufacturing capabilities. And this might help to position them as alternatives to China in the coming years. So at least I think those are the options that I can see, at least for the Asia Pacific at this stage. And it's important to bear in mind, I think, that China itself, Chinese wages have been rising. And at the same time, again, the U.S.-China trade war has really highlighted the uncertainty surrounding Chinese suppliers and so forth. So it's been happening for a while now that countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and others have been trying to develop internal capacity and the capacity of their neighbors to fill those gaps, potential gaps.
Okay, we have a question here from Tony Calladine. It's about China's relationships with its neighbors. Is it likely that China, Russia, and India strengthen their relationship economically, or could we put it another way, perhaps? Is this crisis going to result in China reaching out to either Russia or India to strengthen relationships?
I think China might want to, but it's a different question as to whether or not Russia or India will be willing to join China in such an undertaking. I think India especially with talk about the Indo-Pacific and so forth, India has gradually been drifting farther away, I think, from China. And as a result, it's been impacted severely by COVID-19 as well. So I don't think India will be a willing partner in those schemes. Russia, on the other hand, is a different question. It, in part, I think, depends on how COVID-19 plays out in Eurasia, and also whether or not China continues to fund many of its projects that are emerging across Eurasia as well. Because that will be a clear indicator as to whether or not China is a viable economic partner for Russia. And I think what we've seen in history is that the Russian are pragmatists. So even if the Chinese and the Russians have those long-term historical ties, it doesn't mean that they will jump on the Chinese bandwagon. So I think I think Russia, alongside other countries, will have to wait and see whether or not China still has the capacity to be an economic powerhouse post-COVID-19 before they decide embarking on a reinvigorated economic relationship or partnership. Great.
Going back a few weeks now, or maybe a week or two, time moves fast in a COVID environment, I guess. There were a lot of articles suggesting that now is China's time to shine, that the COVID, that its ability to deal with COVID-19 relatively quickly would result in a soft power boon for China. Since then, of course, we've had a lot of criticism from the United States. I'm wondering what your take on this is. This is probably going to be our last question. Robert Ward asks, has there been a loss of trust in China as a result of COVID-19?
Again, I'm afraid I can't really give a straightforward answer on that. I think the most straightforward response I can give is that yes and no. I mean, yes, in that, it depends on the country. I think in Italy, for example, we've heard about how there's just been this surge in trust in China as a result of Italy having been so-called forsaken by the rest of the European Union in the early days of the virus's spread. But then at the same time, certainly in Australia, we've seen how trust in China has waned considerably as a result of China's mishandling of the COVID-19 spread domestically, but also what is perceived to be misinformation, disinformation campaigns emerging from Beijing as well. Within Southeast Asia, I would say that, again, it's a mixture. Amongst the region's governments, I think they would still say that they have they still put a high degree of faith and trust in China. Within societies, I think it's slightly different. And remember that anti-Chinese sentiments in the region has been around and has been rising for a while now. So, and not just because of COVID-19. So really, COVID-19 does present an opportunity for Beijing to try and embark on a soft power offensive to increase trust and confidence. But at the same time, I think it's really risky with any kind of soft power offensive. It can be seen as disingenuous. It can be seen as hiding more deceptive motives. And certainly with all the discussion about mass diplomacy and whether or not China is just trying to buy curry favor from other countries at this stage, I think that kind of highlights how Beijing itself needs to be very careful about how it pursues soft power during this time, and to appear and to show itself to be a sympathetic but also a genuine partner to these countries during the COVID crisis, but also post-COVID-19 as well. So I'm afraid, again, I don't have a straightforward answer to that, but I think we're seeing a lot of polarizing views across different countries in the Asia-Pacific region, but also in Europe and in North America as well.
Fantastic, Pichamon. That, I think, is that. We don't have enough time. We're just nudging against 7 o'clock now.
Sure.
It's a shame we can't give you a round of applause as one of our usual events, but I'm sure the audience are applauding at home. If you are applauding at home, and if you've liked what you've seen today, there's plenty more events on international affairs on our website, internationalaffairs.org.au. On the left-hand side, you can scroll down and see the events button, and you'll see all of our webinar events that are scheduled for the next couple of weeks. So thank you once again, Pichamon. It was a fascinating discussion, and I'll look forward to seeing you when we get out of lockout.
Oh, no, thank you very much again, Bryce. And also thank you to all of the questions and to everyone who joined us this evening. I'm also sorry that I can't answer all of your questions, but I will certainly take a note of them. And if you'd like to reach out to me via email, I'll be more than happy to answer any further inquiries that you have. You can search for my name on Google, I think, and my email should pop up. But thank you again. I hope you enjoyed it. And it's really weird talking. It's like talking to yourself, really. But I do value the questions that you've asked. So thanks again, Bryce, and to the AIIA.
Thank you, everybody, and good night.
Good night.